All right, well, it's 5:32, so I think I'll go ahead and get us underway. I am very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's event on integrated floodplain planning, being co-hosted by Whatcom County Government and the Whatcom Watersheds Information Network. My name is Cheryl Lovato-Niles. Before we get started, I just want to briefly introduce you to the Whatcom Watersheds Information Network, which we call WIN for short. WIN is a diverse group of citizens, organizations, businesses, and nonprofits all engaged in water and natural resources education in Whatcom County. We are an apolitical, non-advocacy organization. And our mission is to protect and restore our waters and watersheds by enhancing education, public involvement, information exchange, and collaboration. I invite you to sign up for our newsletter, which comes out about once a month and includes information on regional and local events such as this one, training opportunities, new funding opportunities, new research findings, and lots of other useful news. In order to sign up for the newsletter, you would just go to any page on our website, which is you can find at whatcomwin.org. That's whatcomwin.org. And if you sign up for the newsletter, we can assure you that we will not share your email address, we will not try to sell you anything, and we will not ask you for money. Tonight, we're going to learn about integrated floodplain planning efforts underway in Whatcom County. But before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the flooding that occurred in November of 2021 was devastating to many communities and individuals in Whatcom County and the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, and that many people are still suffering as a result. And it's understandable that people may feel hurt or angry around this topic. The goal of this event tonight is to provide information on Whatcom County's work to find Nooksack River solutions that will reduce future flood risk, recover salmon populations, and improve the future for agriculture and floodplain communities in the Nooksack Basin. We encourage you to ask questions and make the most of this opportunity to learn about integrated floodplain planning underway, work that has been completed and work that is also underway. But please keep in mind that our speakers tonight are not policymakers. They are technical experts. So the information that they're going to share today will be useful when engaging with policymakers to tell your stories and when you're offering your opinion about what will make a difference. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after each presentation. You may ask your question via the chat or in person. If you wish to ask something using the chat, you'll just you'll click on the chat button, which is in the bottom controls on your Zoom screen. If you don't see the controls there, you might need to hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen and that will bring up the controls. And click on the chat button, it'll open up the chat box on the side for you and you can type your questions there. If you wish to ask your question in person, I would ask that you please raise your hand. Again, you'll get to those controls, you'll click on reactions, and then when you click on the reactions button, you'll see another bar that says raise your hand. Click on that, then we'll see that your hand is raised, and then when it's time for Q&A, we will go ahead and call on you to ask your question in person. We also ask that you please try to keep your questions succinct, and that if you have a comment other than a question, please limit it to 2 minutes so that we are able to answer as many questions as possible tonight. I am pleased to have support from a couple of WIN colleagues tonight that I want to express appreciation for. Rebecca Schlotterbeck with the Public Utility District number 1 is here, and Becky Peterson with Geneva Consulting. They are behind the scenes to help make sure everything runs smoothly, and they may step in if I'm struggling to track questions. And I am also very pleased to have support from Jim Cramer tonight, who's going to help introduce our speakers this evening and also to moderate some questions. Jim is the president of Cramer Consulting. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jim, and then Jim's going to go ahead and get us started with our first presenter. So Jim is the president of Cramer Consulting. He is an expert in natural resources, organizational development, and facilitation. Jim has over 35 years of experience in natural resources and public works, public policy, and governance. He builds bridges between science and policy and between diverse interest groups. He has worked in local governments, nonprofit organizations, and as a private consultant, and he has facilitated many different groups with diverse interests and backgrounds. And go ahead, Jim, and get us started.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. And I love to see people's faces. So if you're okay turning on your videos, it's something that I enjoy to see the people we're talking to. I appreciate that and understand if if you're having a bad hair day or something else, you don't want to turn your video on, that's fine as well. I obviously have a bad hair day, but that goes with the haircut. So anyway, thanks for joining us. We'll get right to it. Paula Harris is going to be their first speaker. Paula has over 34 years of experience as a water resource manager, engineer, focused on reducing flood risk and floodplain management. She has a bachelor's of science in agriculture engineering and a master of science in civil engineering. She started her professional career in the Midwest before relocating to Whatcom County. She's a certified floodplain manager and embraces the philosophy that actions that transfer risk without mitigating it are not solutions to flooding. Real solutions come from people working together in collaboration. Paul has worked for the county for over 24 years and hopes to find solutions to the flooding problems in the county before she retires, and hopefully can do that in a way that all people benefit and all communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paula.
Thanks, Jim. Can you guys see my slides okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. So today I am going to give a very short introduction to the process, our Nooksack River Floodplain Integrated Planning, which we call FLIP for short. And before I get into the details, I'm just going to give you a little overview of the context of the basin. So this started as a update to our lower Nooksack River Comprehensive Flood Hazard Management Plan from 1999. We want to update it. We want to broaden the geographic scope as well as the different interests that we look at. So we are using the same reach layout as we used in our old flood plan. So as the river comes out of the mountains, out of the Cascade Mountains near Deming, we have 4 different reaches of the main stem river. And then we have this reach 5, which is the Everson-Sumas overflow corridor, which was such a focus November of 2021. And just what this looks like pictorially on an aerial, this red graphic here is the latest draft mapping from FEMA. And all these yellow dots here are homes reported damage during the November 21 flood event. So most times the Nooksack comes out of the hills in Deming and heads kind of north towards Everson, and then goes pretty much west towards Linden and then into Bellingham Bay. But during large flood events like we saw in November 21, a large part of the flow actually overtops after it squeezes through Everson and Nooksack and then heads towards Sumas and into British Columbia. And any of those that saw the news in November 21 saw what that actually looks like on the ground. But this is what it looks like on the ground right there at the Everson overflow. So that's that intro picture. This is the Everson Bridge here. The river's flowing towards us in this picture. And you can see this is that bank where the beginning of the Everson overflow starts. And so the water overtops this bank here. Once it gets over Emerson Road here, it's left the Nooksack system and it's headed to Canada and never is going to end up in Bellingham Bay. So it just gives you a little kind of lay of the land. And I am Paula Harris, as Jim introduced, and I'm Whatcom County's River and Flood Manager, and I help communities and floodplain residents reduce future flood damages. This is a project we're under construction on Canyon Creek. It shows that we actually do get to construction. So the process that we used to start this planning process about 5-6 years ago, I started by establishing this FLIP steering committee, and I'll talk about the membership of these different teams on the next slide. But we started developing this flip steering committee with a kind of the broader base of interests on it to drive this process so that it was multiple objective instead of just kind of flood with our blinders on. So that group got together. We started putting together this flip team, which essentially is a list I maintain of over 100 people of all the different agencies at the federal, state, local level, even down to our special district level, which includes diking districts, drainage districts, watershed improvement districts, pretty much anybody involved in a government or a special district that has a stake in river management. And those special districts actually include a lot of floodplain residents and landowners because they're most interested in doing that type of work. And similar to the old plan, we started with these 5 reach teams, one for each reach of the river, with the intent to, as we get into that detailed planning to take a subset of this big flip team and create these reach teams that really know those specific reaches of the river. Now, after the November 21 flood, we kind of reconnoitered a little bit because it became clear to me that, you know, if we just look at reach 5, which goes from Everson to Sumas, they may have different interests in mind than the reaches downstream, reaches 1, 2, and 3. So we added this flow split team, which basically has members from all these different reach teams so that we can kind of represent the upriver interests and the lower river interests as we contemplate what to do at that flow split in Everson. So I'm having a little trouble with my animation here. Sorry about that. So the structure that we set up in terms of the people structure side of the structure. So this left-hand side is my steering committee. So we've got Whatcom County, we've got myself and the staff members there representing the flood side. We've got a natural resource planner representing our interest in salmon recovery. We've got both tribes at the table. And then we've got a representative of agriculture, Fred Lickel, who works with the Ag Water Board and a lot of the diking and drainage districts. So this one Ag Water Board icon actually has probably more about like 25 different special districts under it or so. But very broad representation. We've got our local entities, which is our small cities, the Whatcom Conservation District, the PUD. We've got our state partners, which are primarily resource management agencies, as well as WSDOT, who's got a lot of infrastructure in the floodplain. And then we've got our federal partners, including the Corps of Engineers and FEMA, who are a little bit more involved in flooding, NOAA Fisheries, who's more on the permitting side of things, and then the USGS, who brings some of their higher science to us because we need it on the Nooksack, because Todd will show you why later on tonight. So again, after the November flood, originally, you know, with my floodplain manager hat here in this Whatcom County icon, I was really trying to represent all the small city interests at the steering committee level. But after the flood, that became a little awkward for me. So we decided to kind of revamp that and basically took all those small cities and brought 2 new representatives to our steering committee to represent those upriver and those lower river interests. So they, so I didn't have to try and represent both sets of interests. So we've been, you know, we set up this process. We tried to make it adaptable, and we've already used, done some adapting to it to make it better fit the real problems on the ground in our community. The process itself, we started by, in our very first meeting, established a vision and goals for this process, and I'll share them with you in a minute here. The first few years, we really focused on the technical work, and you're going to hear a lot about that today, here and now. We had different aspects of technical work, some sediment study by the USGS, hydraulic modeling, which Todd's going to talk about, geomorphic assessment, which Karin's going to talk about, and then the habitat assessment, which Cramer Fish Sciences, Jason's going to talk about that. We also did, you know, met with our cities and some of our ag districts, and really tried to understand some of those floodplain issues and what those damages that they see during a flood and what are the challenges from the infrastructure side of things. So this took about 2-3 years to get done. And then we basically launched into that detailed reach planning. And we started this early in 2020, squeezed our first reach team in right before COVID really shut everything down. excuse me, and this is where we really start to drill down and integrate the needs and the problems within a specific reach. We try and look at all the different problems from the fish and the flood side of the world and integrate those into integrated reach strategies and objectives. We work with our stakeholders and our tribes to identify opportunities, different project ideas. We evaluate different alternatives, and then ultimately we establish priorities within each reach for a set of projects within each reach. When we get through all the different reach teams, then we can kind of roll those up into a watershed-wide set of actions. So we'll have all those different reach lists, and then we'll kind of blend them in together to get a basin-wide list of priorities at the basin scale. And then we can document that process, have a capital project list and an implementation strategy, complete the final plan, and that capital project list will drive the river and flood capital program likely for decades to come. I just want to, before I hand it off to our other presenters, I just want to walk through very quickly these draft flip goals, and these are still draft. We likely will keep them draft until the end, just in case we missed something along the way that will come up in our detailed planning. But the number one flip goal was to reduce the risk to public safety. And, you know, we did have a fatality in the November 21 flood. We don't ever want that to happen again. So this is really front and center, very important goal of this process. We also want to optimize benefits to public infrastructure, private property, and to public resources, those natural resources, including salmon habitat, water quality, and other ones that are not listed here. So we're really looking for multiple benefit solutions that really check a lot of the boxes on the funding agencies' applications and really meet a lot of needs for our community. We also want to provide a comprehensive understanding of the river, how its form and its functions, and the importance to the resource-based economies, including agriculture and fisheries, which are two biggies for our river system. And you'll get to see some of the results of that tonight. So a lot of this technical work really does provide that comprehensive understanding of river processes and how it affects the different interests. We want to protect and maintain, and where feasible, restore river and floodplain habitats and habitat forming processes. The river can build habitat a lot cheaper than we can. So if we can give it the room to do that in some key locations, we can maybe save a lot of tax dollars in the long run and create good habitat. Hold on one sec. We want to create a more resilient flood risk reduction system now and into the future. You know, we are seeing bigger flows, more frequent flooding. So we want to make sure that what we plan and construct in the near term has some, you know, durability into the system, into the future, so it can deal with changing flows and sediment pulses that this river is seeing with climate change. We also want this to be a practical plan. We want to have that prioritized list of action items so that we can start implementing this even before the plan is written. We do have early action projects. We've already built one in partnership with the Bertrand Watershed Improvement District. We've got another one that came out of our Reach 2 charrette. That's a 100% design now that we're looking for funding. And we intend to keep trying to implement projects even though this plan is not done. And then finally, we want to build consensus around mutually beneficial outcomes. So we really are looking for those win-win-wins that have broad support and are easy to find funding for. So that is all I have. Yes. So any questions?
So we have a few minutes before we want to kick into the next presentation, but are there any quick questions on the kind of broad overview that Paula provided? What does FLIP stand for again?
Floodplain Integrated Planning.
Okay. Any other quick questions that people have?
There was an earlier chat from Ross Klein. Just curious if any FLIP members had a chance to attend the SUMAS meeting recently, which was in regards to proposed housing development. I was not able to attend.
No, I didn't go to that meeting.
There's a couple of other flip members. Mike is saying he didn't attend it either. So it doesn't sound like it from at least the people that are here. Question if the planning process has been contentious.
Not, I mean, it's been very respectful so far. I mean, everybody doesn't agree on everything, but at this point in time, we haven't really had any major flare-ups. And I'm knocking on wood.
And is the city of Bellingham involved in the floodplain integrated process?
No, they are not, because they're not part of the Nooksack River floodplain. It's really focused on the Nooksack River.
And does the county want to purchase floodplain properties for flood storage and habitat? If so, what's the process?
The county has, since the November 21 flood, we have developed a buyout and elevation assistance program. We have really focused on the areas that were really damaged badly by the November 21 flood to start with. Our main focus on the first round of grants that we put in was really trying to create some corridor for the floodwaters to go. But if you are interested in having your property be bought out because you don't want to live in a floodplain anymore, the process right now is to send me or one of my staff, Deb Johnson right now is the project manager of this program at this point in time, to send us an email and we can talk to you and kind of follow up with you and see where you are on the lay of the land and whether it would fit well into one of our buyout programs.
And Paula, is it correct that the county, not part of your program, but part of other county programs, has bought property for habitat purposes?
Have we bought it for habitat?
I don't know if John Thompson knows or Gary.
I mean, we typically, when we're buying it, it's in the floodplain, and it's typically multiple objective, because if it's under my program, it's typically got some relation to flood. But by buying it to get somebody out of there, it opens up opportunities for habitat as well.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
Thank you.
What will be done with the houses that are bought, Paula?
We demolish the houses.
Okay, I think Cheryl's going to introduce the next speaker.
Yes. All right. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Karin Boyd. Karin has a master's degree in geology and 35 years of work experience in applied river science. She has been involved in several projects in Whatcom County since the late 1990s. In 1999, she helped the county assess erosion and flood risks on the Canyon Creek alluvial fan. Over the past decade, she has worked with the county evaluating the evolution and current condition of the Nooksack River. She continues to be involved with the Floodplain Integrated Planning, FLIP, process, helping to provide geomorphic context towards the development of flood management strategies in the Nooksack River corridor.
Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. Are we good? Okay. Hi, again, my name is Karin Boyd. I'm a geomorphologist and been working on the Nooksack, and my role tonight is to give a general introduction of the layout in terms of geomorphology, and this will be brief. I did want to point out that a lot of this stems from a Reach 1 through 4 geomorphic assessment that I did with Andrew Nelson of Northwest Hydraulics and Paul Pittman at that time of Element Solutions. And that's, if anybody is interested in diving into any of this deeper, all that stuff is on Paula's website at Whatcom County. So, sorry. So what we're going to talk about today, major topics, a little bit about the Nooksack River watershed, a little bit about the river itself and its floodplain, and then I'll wrap it up with some management implications relative to those conditions. So here's a map of the watershed, and I've highlighted the three contributing subwatersheds, the North, Middle, and South Forks. And what I really wanted to point out here is the upper watershed is dominated by the Cascades and Mount Baker, which is at almost 11,000 feet. And then we come down in 58 miles, we're at sea level. We're at 0 feet elevation above sea level. And what happens here is the majority of the drop occurs between Mount Baker and Deming. At Deming, we're already down to 220 feet elevation. And that's where this reach starts that we're working on in pink. And so we come down, it's much lower gradient as we come out onto the approaching Bellingham Bay. And then these are elevations that might be of interest as well. By the time we get to Everson, which Paula talked about, this overflow, we're at 78 feet, and then we come down through Linden and down to Bellingham Bay. I also put in that elevation at Sumas because you can see how low it is, where we have this low basin that heads to the northeast towards Sumas Lake and the Fraser River watershed. So one thing that's interesting about the Nooksack is this is work that was done by the USGS in 2011, and basically looking at estimated sediment yield in the different watersheds of Puget Sound. If you normalize them to area, the Nooksack actually has the highest sediment yield per square mile of any river in Puget Sound, any major river. The Skagit actually produces more sediment, but again, relative to its watershed size, the Nooksack produces more per square mile. And what they found really was that all of the big producers are rivers with glaciated volcanoes in their headwaters. One thing I did want to point out here is that there's a large sediment load coming down, but the vast majority of that is not bed load material that comes into the management situation, but is suspended load that'll move right through the system. But then a smaller fraction of that is the bed load, meaning sand, gravel, and coarser material. So the Nooksack is kind of neat because it fits this watershed zone concept really nicely. If you look at the upper watershed here in the Cascades and then coming downstream towards Bellingham Bay, you can actually look at these various places. This is Deming, where the three forks come together, creating the main stem Nooksack, coming down to Everson, Ferndale. This is where I-5 crosses, and then down to Bellingham Bay in the Delta. So those four reaches that Paula showed, that's how we've been looking at this and analyzing these segments. But this upper reach from Deming to Everson, again, this is where Paula showed the overflow heading into Sumas. And then we come, and this is really a transfer depositional reach where there's a lot of coarse sediment being stored and reworked and moved around. And then as we get flatter, the river simplifies, and then we end up coming out at the Delta. Reach one is the Delta reach. Looking at water surface slope, this is from LiDAR data. We just pulled a profile all the way down. You can see that from Deming down, we're looking at about 36, 37 miles of channel, I think. And up at the upper part, a 0.22% slope, which is really common for dynamic meandering streams to be in that slope range. And then as we come down, you see it gets flatter and flatter in these various subreaches until we're at a much lower slope at the Delta. So it loses almost 90% of its slope from Deming to Ferndale. And as a result, the river really changes from the upper end to the lower end. This is that upper reach 4 between Deming and Everson, and you can see lots of braiding and anabranching channels, which are channels that flow around forested island, and then smaller braided channels that flow around gravel bars, and coarser material, steeper. And then coming downstream on the right, you can see it's much flatter, much more fine-grained, much simpler single thread meandering channel form, but that doesn't have a lot of lateral movement to them, both because of natural conditions, it's low energy, and also because of management, which I'll hit on as well. But there's a really fascinating complication about the Nooksack, and that is based on work that was originally done by Michael Maudlin and Paul Pittman in 2003, where they presented a paper, I think it was at Geological Society of America, but they basically postulated that the Nooksack has changed course, potentially as recently as over the last several hundred years. And so this is their graphic where here's the Nooksack coming out of the mountains, and this low area that goes up to Sumas Lake and up into Canada, they postulated that that was the Nooksack River at that time, and that the Nooksack since then has avulsed, or just dramatically jumped into a new channel to its current course. And the geology suggests that it jumped into old glacial outwash channels. It spilled over and found a new route down to Bellingham Bay. And with time, there's been more and more supporting information for that. This is a book, Before We Lost the Lake, that was built about Sumas Lake, and a lot of the engineering work that had gone up there with draining and reclaiming the lake bed for agriculture primarily. But at any rate, in that book, he quotes that in 1962, an elder, a Chilliwack elder, Bob Joe, told an interviewer that in olden times, part of the Nooksack came through Sumas City here and emptied out on this Sumas River. So there's indigenous oral history. There's relic channels and oxbows in the Sumas Valley, again, the one Paula showed going to the northeast, that are consistent with the Nooksack planform. The channel size of the creeks that flow in that direction, they're oversized compared to the water that they carry. They've done stratigraphic work and found Mount Baker derived sediment in the Sumas Valley. And then there was some work done on the Bellingham Bay Delta, which suggested that looking at its growth rates, that delta is probably only 400-ish years old. So if you think about it, it's a dramatic change. In my career, I've never seen quite an avulsion of this size. You know, we think of the Atchafalaya on the Mississippi and things like that, but pretty dramatic change when we're looking at hundreds of years. So if you can conceptualize this, we had the Puget Lobe ice sheet 15,000 years ago that came all the way down south of Seattle. It was 3,000 feet thick, and it had these kind of advances and retreats, and it ended up leaving all this glacial outwash sediment, of which there's a lot in the Nooksack River Valley, terraces of outwash material. So this is an example of a glacial outwash paying kind of braided streams, and you get a lot of kind of unique geologic environments in these outwash plains. But then the Nooksack, it appears, relocated into those materials. And what that means is that below Everson, so here we come to Everson. In the event the Nooksack was primarily running to the Sumas Basin, started overflowing into these outwash channels, and then eventually captured, the outwash channels captured the river, and it primarily goes in that direction at low flow. It's a younger river down there, and it's formed in these glacial outwash materials. And there's definitely a lot of Nooksack River deposits, but when you float, you can see up here on the left, this is just below the guide meridian near Linden, and you can see really different types of sediments deposited in the, exposed in the stream banks. In this case, evidence of rapid burial. There's trees sticking out that you can climb on. That's Andrew Nelson, I think, climbing on those trees, big sandy foresets, but it looks like unique geology for sure down there. Shifting a little bit to river management, there's been a lot on the Nooksack, as most major rivers in Puget Sound. I'm going to focus on the removal of wood. We're going to start there. Straightening of the channel, which started about the same time, about 120 years ago. Levee construction and bank armoring. So the snag boats. So snag boats became really popular in the Southeast, Mississippi, cleaning out those rivers. Corps of Engineers were very busy, and the Nooksack was just loaded. There was one logjam that was over a mile long, and it impeded commerce. And so in 1897, there was a congressional appropriation to get out there and clear those jams. And they had these snag boats that would come and just pull all the wood out. And Ellen Wall wrote an article about this. She's at Colorado State. She's been really interesting in the impacts of wood removal on river systems. And she noted that in Washington State, these were the main rivers, the Skagit, the Stillaguamish, Nooksack, Snohomish, and Snoqualmie, that these snag boats ran up. But if you read her paper, she said originally they were removing wood, but it took off. They were doing blasting, dredging, bank stabilization, levee construction. So this is, you know, over a century ago, we started modifying these systems. By the 1930s, the levee started being built and expanded upon, and you can see, we map them through time using air photos, and you can see them expand. And now we're in the 1970s, and you can see that there's still some pretty active management going on, in this case, burning wood. And there was also a fair bit of sand and gravel mining at that time. This might be associated with that, and levee expansion. So the result of this has been, as in many rivers, simplification of the system to become more confined, less dynamic, and just more carefully, tightly managed. This is an example of that. This is Everson. This is the bridge that Paula showed a photo of, Everson Bridge, where it was flooding here with water heading to the north. But the photo on top is from 1933. And this reach from this bridge downstream, it's 3 miles long. And you can see that in 33 on top, there's a lot of open bars. It's kind of wild and woolly. There's rather high rates of change, and it's pretty complex. And then by 2016, the red and black lines are levees, and the little dots are bank armor, rock riprap. And so we were tracking these changes through time. And in this case, this reached 2.4 miles of side channels have been lost. The belt width has narrowed by about half since the 30s. In this reach as well, 24% of the corridor is levied and 65% of the banks are armored. I also wanted to point out that armor failure happens not uncommonly when you're kind of squeezing down on these systems. And in this reach, 4,200 feet, we mapped as having failed. And this is an example right here where you can see the mapped armor from the county, but the river got behind it and flanked it. And there's a certain amount of riprap out in the river on the Nooksack, like here. This, if you look at bank armor, we were just looking at 65% of this upper reach 3, but you go downstream and 90% of the bank lines tend to be armored with riprap. Much of it is very old. And you can see here, this stuff is decades old and stabilized by really dense, mature tree roots. And then at the bottom here, you can see the amount that has failed. And this is how we map it. It's pretty evident when you start looking at high resolution photography to see these areas where it's been flanked. So the simplification, the channel length, this is showing through time. So this is 1933, which is the start of the best imagery we have, to 2016. And you can see that the main channel, which is this blue line on top, it's maintained its length, coming from Deming down, about 35 miles long. But if we start mapping those anabranching channels that are flowing around islands, wooded islands, or secondary channels, which are flowing around gravel bars, there's been a continuous decay in the length of those and the complexity of the system. And so we see this all the time. I mean, that's been the traditional management of rivers to make them more efficient. And so as a result, we end up with a consolidation of more water into one main channel. We increased energy in that channel. And so you have less wood storage, right? It's going to recruit less wood and then store less of it because there's less opportunity to do that. And also definitely less habitat, both riparian and aquatic. A little bit on flood management. The levees are a major component. Again, they're in red and black here. And you can see where Everson, there's levees way up by Deming that confine the river against the valley wall to the south, narrowing it up there. And then we come to Everson, and then a heavily levied section coming around through Linden, and then also down below Ferndale, approaching the delta. And the levees are really interesting because this photo is from the November flood of 2021, looking downstream towards Bellingham Bay. And you can see the levees at quite high water poking out, and they are built on naturally high ground, which is an interesting aspect of this. And that high ground is what's called the hogback. This is relative elevations using LiDAR, and the blues are low elevation and the warmer colors are higher. So you can see this yellow trend along the banks coming all the way down along the river. And that's the hogback. That's the high ground that the levees are actually built on. That's not the levees themselves. It's the levees plus a wider ridge that follows the channel. And I drew a cross section. Here's a cross section coming across. So you can see that the Nooksack River is right here. And here's the hogback with the levees built on them. And then these flood basins behind that can be quite a bit lower than the crest of those levees for sure. And they form these flood conveyance corridors back behind the levees. So what they are is, if you're familiar with it, they're just natural levees. And natural levees are typical in streams that are low gradient, carrying a lot of suspended material, and especially rivers that don't move around a lot, because when the water flows out over the bank, they just drop out that material as the energy drops, and so they'll build a natural levee. They're very common in low gradient, pretty simple systems that don't move around enough to erode those levees out. So another important thing about the levees is that this is the constructed levees now, is they're designed to overtop. And you saw in that photo water going down behind the levees, and that is by design. This is a preliminary map that's based on some older bathymetry, so it's approximate, and it's called a LOP, a level of protection map. And the colors reflect the various flood events that would overtop that levee, what level of protection you get. And you can see that it ranges from the red 0 to 5 to the purple being 100-year protection from the levee. So that overtopping is critical because it allows water to access the floodplain, and then it also allows water to get back when you're moving downstream. So the levees are built on generally high existing ground. They overtop regularly, 2 to 5 year events. But they provide growing season protection. That's their main intent. But at high water, they're definitely hydrologically connected to the Nooksack floodplain. So I want to talk a little bit about the Everson overflow. This is from Todd's shop at Northwest Hydraulics. This shows the flood routing. So we were just talking about this section here, where you can see a pretty wide flood corridor coming down. That's where the levees are. But then also you see this the floodplain heading north into Sumas. And this is that relative elevation model in that area. So Everson is right here. Here again is the bridge Paula showed with the water starting to head out. And I know this is kind of busy. You can see the levees in red and black. You can see the riprap with these little brown dots. The red ones are failed riprap. But the other thing that's really remarkable to me, and I think is one of the most unique things about the Nooksack, is this black and white line right here. That's literally the drainage divide between the Nooksack River watershed and the Fraser River watershed. And so it's the bank of the river. So any water that's heading out, like Paula said, is heading down valley, heading to the north and into the Sumas. In 2021, this levee breached right here. You can imagine a lot of pressure as things start to become a little bit more confined. So the black arrows reflect how much water is heading out, and you can see that there's several overflow points. This is called the Twin View levee right here, and this one has had quite a bit of maintenance. You can imagine there's a bit of a funnel right there as we approach the Everson area and the Everson Bridge. So zooming out, here we have these two routing flow paths, and you can see the elevations are quite interesting through here in terms of any water heading out in that direction. And actually, I'm going to go back a second because I just wanted to point out, you see this armor here. Years ago, we were working on the Nooksack because there was concern that if the river eroded any direction to the north, any distance it migrated northward, that drainage divide was going to lower because you were going to get into more of these blue colors, and that was going to basically allow more water more frequently to head north into the Sumas. So that was the Van Dellen and Riverberry projects were done to prevent that. So there we go. We have water going in two directions. And when you think about flood management, here again is that Everson area. Here's our relative elevation model. And we've got this wide braided corridor and then an abrupt tapering into this newer, recently developing channel and a narrow single thread corridor that's flatter, with water heading out into the Everson Basin. We have bank armor that's contributing to confinement on the river. We have levees that add to that. And so the tapering is pretty abrupt when you start approaching Everson. And there's some management needs to do that. There's the bridge, there's a pipeline crossing up here. But there's various places where there's constrictions in the active corridor of the river. So it kind of hourglasses as you go down. One thing we looked at was the frequency of repair on the levees, and you could see that those levees that are constricting more tend to need more maintenance, and largely I think two reasons. One is the angle to the corridor itself. Like I said, this one has had a lot of maintenance and it's going at almost a right angle to the corridor. But the other thing is the narrower it is, the more often the river's against it, just working on it. So narrower corridor, higher repair frequency and maintenance costs. So as you can imagine, levee setbacks are under discussion, and there's definitely feasibility considerations that are being discussed in terms of goals and objectives, the benefits of reducing floods, the benefits of reducing costs, the benefits to habitat, agriculture, the willingness of landowners. These levees are largely on private land, and then community support. But there's certainly opportunity. The last thing I wanted to finish with is the overriding thing that we're all dealing with, which is this notion of stationarity is dead. And that is basically that everything we do in our work, whether it's flood frequency, a lot of design work, it's based on historic records of flow patterns. And this work was done by, in the middle here, Floodplains by Design and TNC, with their predictions specifically to the Nooksack about changes we might expect into the future. In this case, being a 27% increase in the 100-year flow, going to more of a rain dominant system, and also the issue of sea level rise down at the delta. So there's a whole lot of things going on that need to be taken into account. So in summary, we have high sediment loads. The river gets flatter in the downstream direction, as most rivers do, approaching the ocean. The corridor has been narrowed by levees and bank armor. Floodwaters split at Everson. Some head north through Sumas, creating a complex and international component to flood management. Flows that go downstream are managed to overtop while protecting floodplain land uses during the growing season. And both, as a result, we've got all these natural things that have gone on with this avulsion and this different development rates of the river. And so we've got both natural condition and then human influences, i.e. management strategies that have been active for 120 plus years that affect this kind of continuity through the system. So I will finish by saying that it has been so fascinating working on the Nooksack, but the intersection of geomorphic history, sediment loading, historic management, and an uncertain flood future on top of that make it uniquely challenging for people like Paula, floodplain managers. So with that, I would be happy to entertain questions if we have a little time.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Karin. If folks have questions, feel free to either enter them into the chat, or as I mentioned earlier, feel free to raise your hand. And you can ask your question in person if you'd prefer. Here we go. Tool, I see that your hand is up.
Hi.
Hi.
So yeah, my question is about Canada. You know, I had heard a little bit about about the watershed and the boundaries of the watershed, but I'm curious how much of volume of water in terms of percentage are we talking about? Is it very minor, or is migration of water north and south a huge issue?
I might ask Paula and maybe Todd to weigh in. I think there's a stage
Should we start
recorder now.
negotiating the Nooksack River Treaty?
Well, I think the largest overflow was in 90, Paula, and that was, what year was that?
21 was bigger than 90, right, Todd? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good chunk of the flow. It's probably somewhere in the order of, it depends on the higher the flow, the more percentage goes that way.
I think in 90, they estimated 5,000 CFS going up there.
Yeah, it was more than that in 21. And it's a good segue into Todd's, unless there's other questions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
there are a few questions in the chat. I'm sorry, did I cut someone off? No? Okay. So here's a question. What's the difference between flow path, floodway, and floodplain?
Well, okay, so flow path, I was just describing as a general routing. Floodway and floodplain are more of a regulatory term, where the floodplain is typically the area inundated during a 100-year flood, whereas the floodway is the main corridor that has a different, a tighter regulatory stringency on it, because if you build in the floodway, you have to show that, well, most floodways you cannot build in, but that's the main routing corridor versus shallower flooding in the floodplain. But that's a regulatory difference.
Yeah, the floodway is it's kind of a man-made definition, but it's supposed to envelop the part of the floodplain that has the deep and fast flowing water and is most dangerous. And theoretically, you could fill the floodplain to the floodway limits, and flood levels would only go up by 1 foot. So it's kind of it's a regulatory construct that doesn't really work that great, but on the ground.
We have another question. What did the LiDAR scan show after the 2021 flood for the riverbed depth in the Everson corridor?
Yeah, Paula, that's being, the USGS is working on that right now, right?
Yeah, well, they actually did they did look at it. Generally speaking, what they showed is that really not much difference in the Everson, in that area upstream of the Everson Bridge. The volume in that really didn't change too much between, I think it was 2017 and 2022. So, there was a slight decrease in the amount of sediment stored in that channel, but it was within the error of the margin of error of measurement. So it stayed pretty much the same between 2017 and 2022.
Do we have any other questions?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karin.
Just give it one more moment since it can take a moment to type. One more question here. Any results from the new Everson side channel project?
I don't know what they mean by results, but that side channel did take water a couple times this year. The way that we designed that project was to get it done this year, which meant it was smaller in scope and scale so that we could get it permitted. And by this year, I meant last year. And so we only dug at the entrance to that channel to try and encourage the river to get in there and open it up. And there was so much downstream channel that it didn't have enough time to do the work to clear out the whole channel and lower the whole side channel. So it did take water. It probably moved a little bit more, but it didn't create a side channel that's connected, at lower flows. Did it help? Maybe a little bit, but we didn't really have any overflow. So I don't know, it helped make some more habitat when it was wet, but we didn't really have an overflow. So I don't know how to really answer that question.
Too early to tell, maybe.
Yeah. Good answer.
All right, well, thank you again, Karin. Jim, if you want to go ahead and introduce our next presenter.
Sure, happy to. So the next topic is creating a computer model of the November 21 Nooksack River floods. Todd Bennett is going to be your speaker. Todd's a principal with Northwest Hydraulic Consultants in the Seattle office. Todd specializes in engineering related to surface water in our environment. He's particularly interested in projects across the Northwest and has led a wide range of hydraulic and hydrologic studies on hundreds of rivers and streams in Washington, Oregon, Alaska, British Columbia. In his bio, it says he's most enthusiastic about developing and applying numeric models to represent complicated scenarios and solve difficult issues while working as part of a team. And I can attest that Todd is excellent in taking computer modeling, which I totally don't understand, and explaining in a way that actually makes sense and has some meaning for me. So look forward to Todd's presentation.
Thanks, Jim. Can you guys all see can anybody not see my screen? Is it coming across okay? Great, Paula, I see you shaking your head. So tonight, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'm excited to show a couple slides here. What you're looking at now is the results of the draft results from one of our computer models. The blue here is showing flooding. You can see here in the lower left corner the tidal simulation that we have going in just a second here. Yep, you'll see the November 21 flood come through here, and I'll rewind this a couple of times just so you can see it. But what I want to talk about today was how this model was developed, some challenges about it, why did we do it, and how are we using it? So again, just for give you some context here, the model, the computer model starts up here at Deming. You can see the overflow that Karin and Paula were talking about, that overflows and flows up to Canada, the area, the valley that gets inundated, and then as the flood wave comes down, inundates the Lummi River, and then also out to Bellingham Bay. So why do we do this? I mean, other than as Jim said, I really enjoy this sort of thing. But why do we do it? Well, one reason is it's a tool. It's a tool for helping us analyze river conditions. In the background here, you can see the Abbott levee. The tool, the computer model, was actually used in designing a fix to this levee. You can see the erosion that's happening here on the bank. And the computer model was used to help analyze depths, velocities, water surface elevations, both with and without the fix at that location. So that's one reason for doing it. And kind of along those lines, it's also used for what if scenarios. And that's really the next step that we'll be applying this model for, is some of these what ifs. For example, what if we were to set back a levee? What if we were to raise it? What if we were to build a new levee? We can also use the model to evaluate what if the flows were to change. There's climate change, there's predicted flows that are going to increase with time. What if that happened? How would that affect things in the valley? We can simulate those. And there's other purposes too. The modeling of the Nooksack in the past has been used for fish evaluation, looking at velocity, depths, flow paths. There's things. There's a number of reasons, number of ways that this model can be applied. This is just some of them. So just by way of background, and this will address one of the questions asked during the next couple of slides here. So when we do this modeling, ideally you're going to have a number of events, excuse me, to simulate. What we're looking at here is what's called a hydrograph. If people aren't familiar with what a hydrograph is, what it shows is changes in either flow or water level with time. So along the x-axis here, can somebody just verify you can see my cursor, correct? Okay, great, thanks, Paula. Along the x-axis here, you're seeing dates. In this particular hydrograph on the y-axis, you're seeing flow. And then plotted here are three different flow hydrographs. The blue is the USGS gauged value at Cedarville. The orange is the USGS gauged value from the February 20 event. And then the gray is an estimated, a calculated 100-year hydrograph that was developed back in early 2000s, actually developed for flows at Deming, but we just put them in here for comparison. Again, changes in flow with time. One thing to note here with the blue dots, the USGS gauge at Cedarville, the gauge went out at the peak. And so what happened exactly during this period on the 15th, from midday, roughly midday of the 15th, isn't exactly known. I'll talk more about that in a second. But what's really fascinating about this particular plot is we know, the February 20 event overtopped, caused damage through Everson and down to Sumas. And just looking at the magnitude of the orange compared to the magnitude of the blue dots, it's huge. I mean, and people who lived out there, know much better than I how big that event was. But then also comparing the blue dots, the November 21 flow at Cedarville to the calculated 100-year hydrograph, those are approaching to be almost equal. They're not equal, but they're close. And so that, I think everybody can agree that November 21 event was a big event. Here's, again, a flow hydrograph, changes in flow with time. The blue is showing here again from Cedarville. Also showing here is the USGS has a gauge. A gauge is, the USGS has ways of recording water level, and then they translate that to flow at particular locations in the Nooksack River. One is at Cedarville, another one is at Everson. And just comparing these two and looking at the differences in flow between those two gauges, just doing simple math, at the peak, there was roughly 16 to 18,000 estimated by the current gauge rating, 16 to 18,000 CFS that overflowed and overflowed the right bank of the Nooksack towards Everson, Nooksack, all the way to Sumas and into Canada. It's a crazy amount of flow. And again, I'm not saying anything new to people who were out there and experienced this, but from looking at other events in the Nooksack, it's amazing. Not only was it a large amount of flow, by comparing these two graphs, that flow difference lasted for almost a full day. It's just amazing how much water was out there. One thing to point out, excuse me, is that, this is a rough comparison between the two. Yes, there's some local inflows that occur between there, but those are relatively minor compared to the overall flow on the Nooksack. So one of the things that we do in developing the computer models is what's called calibration. And that's adjusting the model parameters, which I'll talk about here shortly, to replicate observed events. In this particular case, we developed a computer model of the November 21 event, and fortunately had a lot of good observed data to calibrate the model to. Some people on this call provided some of that data. So what observed data do we use to calibrate the model? Well, there's what's called high water marks. And in the background here, the image is an example of that. It's a little bit faint, but if you see in the yellow arrow here is pointing to it, there's a mud line that runs along the wall here and across the door. So high water marks could be that. Number of people during the flood were out there and they're staking the level of the water, the highest level it got at, and those came back and were surveyed later. All sorts of ways to collect high water marks, and we use that. We check those high water marks to the simulated water surface elevation that comes out of the numerical model. There's also hydrographs. We have the USGS gauges, record data, stage, and then they convert that to flow at a number of locations. The county also has stage hydrographs at a number of locations that we can use to check the model. And probably not surprising, there's a lot of information out there on the internet that we can use to calibrate the model to. There's drone footage. We were up in an airplane, took some photos there. There's satellite images, just a lot of information from this November 21 event that we can compare the model to. In addition, my talk tonight is really about the November 21 event, but we've also looked at other larger events and calibrated the model to the February 20, November 18, November 2017, to name a few, as well as looking at lower flows in just completely in-bank events as part of this. And Why do we calibrate? Well, when we have a good calibration, then we have faith in that when we use the model as a tool to evaluate setting back a levee or what have you, we have faith in those results. So again, I'd mentioned there's a wealth of calibration data for this particular event. Over 400 high water marks were collected and either provided to the county that then were provided to us or collected by the county. Each one of these orange dots is a high water mark, a mark on somebody's house, again, what have you, throughout the basin. So we've got great coverage of those high water marks. The blue dots show gauge locations. Again, those hydrographs that I referred to that we can compare the model to. Again, pretty good distribution of those points. So just a couple things about the model development. I got 2 slides here on this, so we'll go at a very high level. So the model extends from Deming all the way downstream to Bellingham Bay and Lummi Bay. Roughly, the rough location of cities are shown here for reference. It also includes the Everson overflow. We sometimes call that Reach 5, which routes the flow from the overbank into Sumas and then further into Canada. In developing this model, then we specify a flow hydrograph at the upstream end. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're specifying a tidal boundary at the downstream end that actually comes from Cherry Point. And then we also need to define within the computer model the geometry of the river. In this particular model, it's what's known as a 2-dimensional model. It has both X and Y components in representing the geometry as well as an elevation. Shown here is the topography. The lighter blue colors are lower, going to the darker orange and lighter orange and darker orange, which are higher. Here's our Nooksack. I've zoomed in one area here just to show a little more detail. So in this part of the Nooksack, this is right around the guide meridian, you can see this really dark, almost brown color here, and here, those are levees. And then you see the channel here. And the way the computer model works is that topography, that elevation, that ground elevation is broken up into different areas, what we call as a mesh. And you can see here in this black image, those mesh lines. And then each one of those mesh lines is intersected with the topography, and that's the information that defines the geometry within the hydraulic model. We can make small meshes for a lot of detail or big meshes for less detail. Also, that goes into that computer model is we add bridges, information for culverts. There's a number of model parameters that are set in there. A main one is the roughness, and we set different roughnesses based on land use or land type. So you might set one roughness for water, another roughness for ag land, and another roughness for dense trees. All that gets put together then into the computer model, and there's a complex set of equations that do the computations for each one of these cell faces in the mesh, and produces the animation that I showed earlier. So a number of challenges in developing this particular hydraulic model. This here is showing cross-section plots at Cedarville. So along the x-axis we have a distance, and along the y-axis we have elevation. And so these are cross sections that the USGS collected at the Cedarville gauge. Now, and again, just to point out, this is preliminary data. This is draft. These haven't been finalized yet, but we can still use them to give us an idea of what's happening in the channel. And each one of these colors corresponds with a different date when the USGS was out there collecting the channel information. And what you can see from these plots is starting on 11/2, the earliest one we're showing here, that during that November event, the channel scoured out almost up to 10 feet at the maximum. So if we look here at 11/16 and 11/29 and compare that to the 11/2 date, it's almost a 10-foot difference just in depth. But also just comparing the overall shape of the channel, you can just see how overall that channel, this is just the channel, the Nooksack channel, has changed or did change during that time. And then after the event, you can see how it starts to fill back in. The dark blue is on 12.1 and then eventually 12.3. It gets roughly back to how it was at the beginning of November. Dealing with, we can account for that in the computer models. It just adds a level of complexity for sure. This isn't isolated at the Cedarville gauge. It also occurs at Everson, documented at Everson, where the USGS captured collected survey cross sections as well. Not as big of a change, but also a change there. Roughly a 5-foot difference at Everson, where we saw a 10-foot difference at a 10-foot change at Cedarville. Some other challenges is estimating. I mentioned that we put an inflow at the upstream end of the model. In this particular case, with the USGS gauge going out, we don't know what the peak flow coming in was. We have some estimates. The USGS put a couple points in here that they approximated, but we don't know for sure what actually happened on the 15th at the peak. And so that is one of the challenges we're working on now is trying to figure out, and we're working a lot with the USGS. The USGS has been great as we've been working on this, just a lot of back and forth of sharing information. But what do we really think based on the numerical model, the computer model? What do we think? What are we guessing is what the shape of that hydrograph looked like during the peak? So that's one of the things we're working on now. But also related to that, the challenge of that. So the GS, here's the Mount Baker Highway runs here, crosses the Nooksack and spans out here, and the USGS gauges the flow here at the opening. But there's also, and this was known, but it's also showing up in the computer model, that there's some overbank flow. The Nooksack overtops the right bank, flows over or underneath the Mount Baker Highway, and flows through here. Well, that flow is not gauged by the USGS. It just adds one more level of complexity to what flow we have to specify at the upstream end. So as I mentioned, I talked briefly, just two slides there on the model development, put that all together and mentioned all the data we have for calibrating. So this, what I'm going to show here is just some examples of the calibration. The results we're seeing so far. This is still underway. We're trying to improve the results even now as we speak. But I'm just going to show some examples here. So again, hydrographs. Now, this is showing the both peaks from November 21. So here's the larger one that occurred on the 15th, and then, as we know, there was a second peak occurred on the 28th. So we're running the computer model here for almost a full month. And on all these plots I'll show here, the computer model results are shown in blue, and the observed is shown in red. And you'll either see a flow hydrograph, which is this one, or a water level hydrograph showing changes in water level with time, depending on which slide we're looking at. But overall, when you look at this, just visually, and we run statistics on this to do a more accurate assessment of how the calibration is. But just visually, you can see that the computer model, this is at the Everson gauge. The model does a pretty good job of replicating flow, both the rise and the fall. We do a good job of matching at the peaks, at the lower flows. This is a pretty good calibration. I'm going to show a stage here at Everson. Here's the stage. Again, matching well at different stages, the rise and fall of that stage. And again, this having a good calibration like this, where we are matching relatively a good match, we do have that confidence then in the model when we do the what ifs that it's an accurate estimate of what would really occur should, say, a levee change be built. Here's the results at Ferndale, a little bit downstream. This is flow. Again, we're seeing a good match in flow, rise and fall, different flows, good match with time, changes over time. And here it is with stage, a decent match. On all these water surface plots, the scale along the left side, the y-axis, is 1 foot increments. So for the most part, everywhere here, we're within a foot of the observed data. I mentioned the USGS has the county has a number of gauges out there that also collected data as well as the USGS. And this is just a sampling from some of those. This gauge here is at the Everson overflow, where we simulate stage. And the gauge only operates there when flow is at the gauge. So that's why you don't see a continuous red line there. But here's where water overtopped at the for the first event and water overtopped at the second event. Again, gauge went out. If I remember right, Paula, when we get to questions, you can remind me, but I believe the gauge went out because it overtopped what the USGS had. Yes, it was above the top of the gauge. The USGS never anticipated the flow would get that high. They have since, as people on this call probably know, they've since changed it. There actually is cameras here. You can monitor what's happening there real time. But with all these, you see a pretty good match. Some an excellent match. Some are pretty good with time. And this is where we're seeing differences. This is what we're working on now to change. So again, what this is saying is that the model is doing a good job of estimating when the water overtopped the right bank, flowed over Main Street and down into Sumas. I just made some notes here if it's an overbank gauge or a Nooksack main channel. This is downstream at Johnson Creek, just upstream or just west of Sumas. And this is showing at the peaks a pretty good match. The reasons that we're off on the receding limb of the hydrographs here and here is those are inflows from those are overtopping flows. Those are flows from Johnson Creek and other tribs, and that needs a little bit of work to get the inflows from the tributaries correct. If I jump down here to Apple, this is on the left bank, just upstream of Ferndale. You can see that we're not draining. The model isn't draining that area fast enough through here. So that's another thing to work on. But generally, you can see here that again, the rise and fall with time of the model matches pretty well the observed or the gauge data. I mentioned those 400 plus high water marks. And what this is showing is we did a computation of the simulated maximum water surface elevation compared to the surveyed high water marks. And kind of what our goal is to get those all within 1 foot. Right now, 70% of those high water marks are within a foot. If we go out to plus or minus 2 feet, 90% are. So what this is it's a histogram showing that in each one of these bins, if you will, is half a foot. So it's showing for this bin here, which is 0 to minus 0.5, we have about 110 high water marks, which fall into that category. In this bin here from 0 to 0.5, we've got 80 high water marks that fall into that category. But again, as the model is right now, 70% of those are plus or minus 1 foot, and many of them are much closer than a foot. So again, continuing to work on this, but even right now, it's what we would call a good match compared to observed data. So where are our next steps? I've just got one more slide here, and then I'll take questions. So what are our next steps from here? There's a number of what ifs that have come out of the flip meetings that we'll be looking at. I'd mentioned that I was also going to continue to refine the model, adjusting model parameters, refining that inflow, trying to get an even better match to the high water marks and gauge data, and really try to nail down what's happening at the Everson overflow. That's one of the questions that's out there is really trying to understand what's happening at that location. When does water overtop? How are things changing there? And that'll be looked at as part of this this exercise. And then also, again, a lot of those what if conditions. What could we do to control the flooding in the area? What happens if we set back levees? What if we raise levees? A number of options there. And again, as I mentioned earlier, looking at changes to flow, climate change, how does that affect the basin as well? So lots of good things coming up, interesting things to work on that will be coming up soon. So with that, I'll end here with the animation and open it up for questions.
Todd, you used the flood events in Karin too. Maybe you could, for people that are not familiar with what some of the terminology means, could you just talk about what is a 100-year flood event?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jim. A very good thing. Yeah, the 100-year event is an event that statistically would occur. There's a 1% chance of it occurring in any given year. There's misconceptions about there when people hear the label 100-year event, but it is statistically it's the event that would occur with probably 1% in any year. Thanks, Jim. That's a great question.
Thanks. And there's a question in the chat, Todd. Was the existing model framework used, and if so, which one?
I think maybe that model's or that question is asking about the FEQ model. There was no, Paula, you're shaking your head.
I don't know. I would just tell her what you used. I'm not clear on that.
Okay. There was a prior model that had been used for many years. It was called the FEQ model that had Gilbert Franz had spent a lot of time. A lot of this information that went into this model informed this model. And this model was developed using the Army Corps' HEC RAS. It's a 2D RAS model.
Right. And then has anyone analyzed how climate change related increases in peak flows will elevate flood risk in the Nooksack Basin? Has the county considered conducting an analysis like Snohomish County recently completed an assessment of how climate change will increase the spatial extent and severity of future floods?
Let me start, and then maybe Paula wants to add onto that. So yes, we have been looking at future flows. SIG with the UW, the climate impacts groups. I saw they were on here today. I don't know if they still are, but yes, we definitely have been looking at it, and we'll continue to look at it. Paula, more you want to add on that?
Yeah, we definitely wrapped the climate impacts group into our discussion when we started designing trying to figure out how high to raise the Ferndale levee so that we can protect all the infrastructure behind it. And there's a lot of uncertainty in climate change, so we kind of looked at a more typical case and kind of a worst case scenario, and we looked at increases in flow as well as pulses in sediment coming downstream. So we really tried to, in the design phase, we haven't done a system-wide look at it, like making a model run like Todd's showing here, because we hadn't had this model yet, but that's certainly something we can do easily. And Alex, if you want to send me a link to that, to my email address, I clicked on it now, but I'll probably forget to save it before then. So I'd be interested in looking at that. So that Snohomish study.
Okay, and Atul, you had your hand raised. You have a question?
Yes, thank you. So this model, what policy related decisions has it already been used to address, or what do you envision would be some good examples of policy related decisions this model could be helpful in assessing?
Paula, you want to feel that one?
Sure.
Maybe repeat the question, Todd. It was kind of soft.
The question he asked was, what policy related questions has this model been used to help answer, or will it be used? Did I get that right, Atul? I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this model has been used. A previous version of this model was used to help us set that levee profile for for our Ferndale project. A previous version was used we basically use it to look at existing conditions versus proposed conditions. We can get from the model information about depth and velocity so that we can design a project to withstand those depths and velocities. And then we can also look at things like, we are intending to use this specific to the Everson overflow area to look at a lot of these different things, like what if we set back the Twin View levee? What if we build berms around the cities? How does that change where the flow goes and who gets, impacted better or worse than they were before? And then what can we do to mitigate any increases in impacts to people who don't want those impacts? So that's the kind of thing. But, the Nooksack River keeps changing so quickly, we keep chasing it. This is like the third set of bathymetry that we've had in this. We started with the 2006 bathymetry, then we had 2013, 15, and now we're up to 2022. So, you know, if we just need a big bubble over Whatcom County so the river doesn't keep moving sediment. But does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and then a question in the chat for the Everson area. How much impact is there from the tributaries, Breckenridge Creek, Sumas River, Kenny Creek?
Yeah, great question. So the question has to do with the Sumas River that's over here and the tribs that are coming in here. That also is included in the model. Actually, as a separate project, we just developed a hydrologic model to simulate those flows. And that's one of the things we're looking at is as the Sumas, it's a little hard to see here, the Sumas River comes into near Sumas, how the timing of those flows coincide with timings of the overflow and how that affects hydraulics. So it is included in the model. It is something we will be looking at, but we haven't looked at that in detail yet.
And there's a question, can you speak to the contributing factor of snowpack?
Snowpack, yep. So yes, so snowpack is addressed. And I just mentioned that Sumas hydrologic model, the effect of snowpack is accounted for in that. And then, and it looks like Paul has a question, and then or a comment, and then for the Nooksack, because we're using a gauged value, that also takes into account whatever's happening with the runoff from Mount Baker. That's all accounted for in that gauged flow.
Yeah, and for the Nooksack Basin, really our snowpack acts as a sponge, but it has to be deep enough to get to that sponging effect. So in October 2003, we had no snowpack and we had intense rains and we had a good sized flood for October, where like the later we get in the season, if we can get in that 3,000 to 4,000 elevation foot range, if we can get, you know, 5+ feet of snow in that range, then our sponge is kind of well formed. So that's basically when it rains really hard, you know, a lot of our upper basin rainfall gets trapped in that snowpack and kind of gets metered down more slowly. So our hydrograph kind of gets flattened a little bit. But when we don't have that snowpack, it becomes a much more flashier system. So that's a little scary to me as a floodplain manager if we do have less snowpack over time. But so what we see is later in the season when our snowpack is built, we typically don't get, that's why most of our floods end up being in November before we get our snowpack formed.
Okay, and then question that maybe Karin also wants to weigh in on, why can't you remove sediment?
Well, I can just, I mean, it's not that we can't remove sediment. We did move some sediment around in that side channel. It's just that, you know, for us to be able to get a permit to be able to do anything meaningful for gravel removal, it's a very big, long process that will likely involve an environmental impact statement and a whole lot of evidence that it's actually going to make a meaningful difference. And I'll pass it to Karin right now to just speak a little bit about the geomorphology of sediment, if she's willing to pop in. I can't.
Yeah, when we were looking at energy distribution coming downstream, you could see places where at high water it might backwater those constrictions and drop sediment, and then flows will like Todd was showing with these cross sections changing. You can have certain time during a flow event material exported and then a lot of deposition on the recession. So I think one of the things we really want to get a handle on is I've seen people do it where you spend a fortune removing tons of sediment and it's back the next year because you're in that hydraulic condition that will promote that deposition. So figuring out that continuity, I think, and Todd, I don't know if you want to describe that in terms of how the sediment transport energy changes in a given area during a flood event. You may not really achieve the results that intuitively you think you might get in terms of reducing overflows and maintaining that channel capacity, because you can lose it instantly.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on to the next presentation?
I have one, while I'm unmuted. Hey, Todd. The 16 to 18,000 going over the overflow. I had not seen that number. That's astounding. I'm wondering if this is going through a community. I'm wondering if you have any sense of the velocities going through.
I'm with you, Karin. You know, and again, we're looking at yes, we've looked at velocities, but until we've refined the model a little bit more, I wouldn't want to speak on those yet. But yeah, it's just comparing the USGS data. It's amazing how much flow, you know, it just documented flow that went off that way. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
But the
Thanks.
velocities were high enough to wash cars off many roads in the overflow corridor, because that happened a lot. Yeah.
So there's a follow-up to the sediment question. If you do basically remove the sediment, doesn't that mean you have half of the overflow?
You know, we really don't know what happens underneath the riverbed. Like, we know that those gauges scour out during the peak of the flow. So if we dig out some sediment and then it scours out, I mean, I don't know that sediment removal is gone. You know, I mean, the river's doing its own digging during a flood. So, but there's a lot of unknowns about what really happens during the peak of a flood in terms of gravel bed rivers. And if I could just speak to Tool's question, is there a possibility of developing a model that treats the river as a dynamic system? You know, all of the models that have been used for decades assume a fixed bed geometry, which means you put a fixed, you know, channel geometry in there, and throughout the flood you're routing, it doesn't change. Right now, there's a research mode at University of Washington where they are trying to do, like, you know, beds that change, but it's you know, in the research mode at the university right now. So, you know, that would be nice, but it doesn't exist really for our use at the time.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Okay.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Todd. Cheryl's going to introduce the next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, our last speaker this evening is Jason Hall. And Jason Hall has over 20 years of experience in fisheries research and restoration effectiveness and status and trends monitoring. He has worked on numerous projects focused on salmonid ecology and habitat use, life history diversity, life cycle modeling, biotelemetry, and habitat restoration from headwater streams to nearshore habitats. His recent work has focused on design and implementation of regional status and trends monitoring at population and landscape scales, supporting integrated recovery and restoration planning through habitat assessments, departures analysis, and co-manager engagement. For example, the floodplain integrated planning process for the Nooksack River, and development and implementation of a long-term restoration effectiveness monitoring plan to evaluate cumulative and project-level biological and physical restoration responses.
All right. Sorry for that long introduction there. Hope folks can see the slides just fine. Yep. All right. Thank you. So first off, thank you to Paula, Karin, and Todd for providing some good introductory context. I think it's going to make my job a little bit easier here to get through this. So just want to start off with a quick introduction, a presentation outline, if you will. I'm going to be going over the results of a habitat assessment that we completed a while ago. And Paula, can you confirm, is this report also on the Whatcom County resources page?
I'm not sure, but we'll check after this.
Okay.
It should be.
I noticed you provided the link, so that might be kind of handy. I think I recall seeing it up there, but in any case, during this presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background just to set the stage here, and then go over our assessment approach and our objectives, and then a really high-level overview of some of the key findings from the assessment, and then take a little a preview into how this information is being used to support development of reach strategies and applications that Paula started off with. So overall, I'm going to be talking about some of the fish and fish habitat context for this that sort of fits nicely and complements with the other work that you heard on earlier. So first, just to kick things off here, we're talking about fish and fish habitat assessment for our project. And just wanted to start off with this simplified salmon life cycle diagram. I think the main point here is just to highlight that salmon rely on a continuum of habitats from the rivers in which they spawn and the juveniles emerge down through the lower river out to the estuary and the ocean. And there's a number of species, in fact, all the anadromous salmon and trout species native to our area rely on Nooksack River habitat. And these are listed here on the right. Anadromous being those species that they spawn in rivers, but mature in ocean environments. And so the key points here are that all of these species rely on the Nooksack River to some degree. Some more than others require differences in rearing periods in different habitats. And even within species, there's some variations that can range from days to weeks to months to even years in different types of habitats. And so there's a lot of diversity here to consider when we're talking about salmon habitat and what we're talking about with respect to assessing salmon habitat in the basin. One of the other key aspects to consider that Karin touched on a fair bit here is that there's been a lot of modification of habitat in the lower Nooksack River, and significant changes have occurred on a variety of the habitats that salmon rely on. I think Karin provided a pretty good summary of this, but we're talking about a lot of simplification of channels, levees, dikes, and armoring, as well as floodplain conversion and disconnection, the Lummi River disconnection in the estuary. All of these are shown in this this panel here. On the left is a reconstruction of habitat estimated around 1880, and then the panel on the right is showing conditions circa about 1998. And so you can see a change in the coloration here is representing changes in various aquatic and wetland habitats relevant to fish. So there's, with this context in mind, there's a lot of opportunities to increase productivity and support recovery planning with respect to fish, given the amount of impacts that have occurred in the basin. And then, sorry, I'm also recovering from a cold, so hopefully don't lose my voice here. Another key point to keep in mind here is that adult Chinook returns, one of the primary species that that recovery efforts are focused on in the Nooksack Basin and other basins in the Puget Sound region, are well below recovery targets and goals. The blue bars on here show the recovery targets for both populations of early Chinook. We have on the left North Fork, Middle Fork, early Chinook, and then on the right South Fork, early Chinook. And you can see those are the recovery targets. The actual escapement or the abundance of adults returning to the system are well below the recovery targets. And these are showing two different time periods in which those have been averaged. And basically you're looking at current returns in the hundreds and recovery targets in the thousands. So this is something just to keep in mind. I'm talking about context for recovery planning in the Nooksack River. So the objectives of our assessment were to quantify and develop an assessment of salmon habitat in the Nooksack River Basin, and or the lower Nooksack River. We use the same reaches that Paula presented on from the South Fork Confluence and Upper Reach 4 on down to the estuary, represented by Reach 1. We did a rapid field assessment under two different flow conditions, the idea being that habitat and fish use changes with different seasons and flows. We conducted surveys during a winter flow period as well as a summer low flow period, and we looked at main stem, floodplain, and estuary habitats. We also compared our results to historical conditions, but I want to just highlight that that was not to represent a target. It's more of just to provide context for where the greatest losses have occurred, just to provide context for informing potential restoration strategies that could be used to address salmon habitat. And we also used the concept that different habitats provide different functions for fish, and that fish use different habitats differently. And so we have this idea that we can translate habitat information into capacity, and that sort of provides us a common currency to evaluate the physical habitat conditions with respect to what it means for the fish. And then we also synthesize this information with the geomorphic assessment and other assessments like Karin presented, and help support the flip reach team processes that Paula was presenting on, and in that process use this information to help identify strategies to restore processes and enhance habitat, which I'll close this presentation with a little discussion on that. So with that, I'm just going to jump into a quick overview of the assessment and results. Again, this is going to be very high level, much more detail in the reports. If you're interested, that would be something to look into. And a lot of these findings are actually going to be pretty consistent with what Karin reported on earlier. So again, just focusing on some of the high level and key highlights here. So one of the things we see pretty readily and not surprisingly is that much of the lower Nooksack River system has been modified with respect to the edges. We call things like armoring, riprap, etc. Hydromodifications, and these affect the form and function of the edges of the river with respect to habitat processes. They tend to reduce erosion rates in most cases, or designed to do that at least. They also increase velocities and potentially disconnect floodplain habitats. They also limit rearing capacity, the idea being that juvenile salmon primarily use edge habitats, and some species rely on freshwater rearing habitats for extended duration, and so some species might be more sensitive than others to freshwater rearing conditions. But the edges of large river habitats are really important for juvenile salmon, and this map is showing a representation of the percent of hydromodified banks in the system, and you can see in the upper reaches where there's less red, there's more unconfined channels. Part of that is natural unconfinement, but in the lower river we have a lot of hydromodified banks due to the natural levees, as well as the armoring and levee systems that have been constructed on those. And then just an example of how we apply this capacity idea in evaluating habitat conditions. This plot is showing our estimated rearing capacities in the various reaches, as well as in different seasons, because again, salmon use habitats in different ways in different seasons. This is for juvenile Chinook, and the dark bars on the bottom represent the estimated capacity of the habitat to support juvenile Chinook salmon under current conditions, the way everything is configured based on our habitat assessment, while the light gray bars on top represent the potential increase in capacity that would occur if all of the hydromodified bank edges were natural bank edges. And the idea here being that the densities of juvenile salmon, or Chinook in particular, vary greatly by different edge types, and hydromodified bank edges are some of the lowest, we'll observe some of the lowest densities of juvenile Chinook in those kinds of environments. And so this plot, this bar chart, is representing that potential gain, and you can see that the gains are higher in the lower reaches where we have more hydromodifications. In this image on the right, I just want to highlight that this is some snapshots I took from the geomorphic assessment report, and the top image shows a typical riprap bank edge, but there's also quite a bit of overgrown riprap banks that occur in the lower Nooksack, and just want to point this out that, you know, we're not just talking about removal of riprap to potentially address these kinds of departures. There's also potential to enhance or roughen armoring and riprap or other hydromodifications that might move the needle towards more of a natural bank condition. So just an idea and a concept to keep in mind, that we're not just talking about removal when we're talking about something like riprap and armoring being bad with respect to fish. Also, as Karin highlighted, there's a lot of differences and natural differences in channel complexity within the reaches. Generally, there's been a simplification of the channel network This translates to reduced productivity and capacity with respect to juvenile fish, because these side channels and braid channels provide important rearing habitats. They also are important habitat forming and maintenance processes, reduced velocities, as well as increased large wood recruitment and retention. Lower reaches are most impaired with respect to estimated historic conditions. Some of that is natural, as Karin pointed out. This plot on the right shows the channel length of secondary channels, or these braids and side channels, compared to historic conditions. You can see it's quite a bit lower. Whereas in the upper reaches, we see actually higher than estimated historical conditions. I think this is just representing that channel complexity is good in the upper reaches. It's not to say that it's more complex than historic conditions. Part of that issue might just be that we have pretty low resolution in the historic reconstructions, whereas our field survey methods provide really detailed and accurate mapping of side channel and braid channel systems. And then along the lines of large woody debris, this large wood also supports important habitat forming processes. It also provides cover for habitat for juveniles, and also can enhance edge conditions. Our capacity approach that we used, we document from the literature that juvenile Chinook densities are up to 7 times higher associated with wood jam habitats. And we use this information to sort of translate similarly to the bank edge conditions, potential benefits from large wood in the system. But in this plot on the bottom right, I just want to show some pretty stark variations in large wood abundance in the different reaches. So in the lower reaches, we have pretty low abundance, and in this case, we're showing summer versus winter flow conditions. This is not historic to current. We actually had a really hard time trying to come up with historical estimates of large wood loading, but under different flow situations, different wood in the floodplain is engaged differently. So we're just showing the differences there. But you can see in the upper reaches quite a bit more large wood compared to the lower reaches, and this might have something to do with the channelization and single thread channel, higher velocities, et cetera, that don't translate to much retention in the system once you get below the upper reaches. And then also floodplain habitat. This example is showing in lower reach 3, the historical reconstruction side by side with our mapped channel networks. And some key highlights here are just that we see a pretty big loss in wetlands and floodplain habitat connectivity. Also see a lot of straightened and modified channels with relatively low diversity, more of like a drainage network kind of configuration as opposed to a natural channel form. This translates to reduced capacity and productivity, as well as reduced floodplain storage, flow attenuation, and recharge. And this image on the right is just showing kind of a typical floodplain channel in this drainage network configuration with relatively low habitat diversity and cover, which impacts the habitat quality for juvenile salmon that may use these habitats for rearing, as well as overwintering for the species that stay in freshwater for extended periods of time before migrating out. And then lastly, I just want to look at the estuary again, highlighting that there's been substantial changes in estuary habitat, but there is some good news here as well. We have in total about estimated about 50% loss of tidal wetland habitats, and this is important for some species like Chinook and chum, which may have extended rearing periods in estuary habitats as they transition to the marine environment. But the main source of loss here is from the disconnection of this lummi lobe up here. On the image to the left, you can see 1880, this extensive network here. And then 2013, pretty much we're disconnected, and access is really from seaward side. But one other difference I want to point out is actually since that disconnection, the Nooksack lobe has prograded or increased into the bay. And so we see a net increase in this area. You can see the comparison over here. And actually the total distributary area has increased relative to the historical condition based on the information we have. In this lobe of the delta is actually one of the best estuary habitat in the Puget Sound region compared to some of the other areas that have been impacted. And so there's some good news in that assessment there, but still a lot of loss compared to historical conditions. And then just want to close with a couple examples of how this information is being used, sort of tying it together, and images here from our Reach 2 charrette meeting, as well as an on-site meeting we had at Cougar Creek, which is one of the projects we developed from this. And so I just want to show with this table, basically, we've taken this information from the habitat assessment, and we've identified some strategies that can be linked to the what we call departures or impacts to the habitat. And this is showing the pluses are just showing the reaches in which those strategies would potentially apply to restoration in those particular reaches. And so this image on the left is just showing sort of the flow of the process here. We feed in the habitat assessment results with our reach team meetings, and then we identify projects to address flip objectives in the various reach team meetings and charrettes. And one of the outcomes from that work that we did early on was we took a deep dive into Cougar Creek as one of our tributary and floodplain corridor improvement projects. And we used the information we developed from the habitat assessment, as well as some new information collected via some desktop analysis, GIS, and other things, to identify some restoration opportunities, and then use that to help support development of a restoration plan, which largely focused around replacing a floodgate, but working with the landowners to come up with restoration strategies and configurations to meet their needs, while also meeting the two primary objectives to improve fish passage and access to rearing and refuge habitats, as well as improving drainage and flood protection. And then I believe that work is scheduled for 2024 now. 4, yeah, I'm seeing 4 from Paula. Okay, so that's coming, but I also want to highlight some cool stuff that we're doing as part of this, because one thing that often gets missed is demonstrating the effectiveness of restoration actions, especially when so much money is tied into these types of projects. So one of the things we're trying to do as part of this project, we've already collected some samples before the floodgate is replaced, and we're going to collect some more before that happens as well. But we're using this technique called eDNA, which is basically collecting water samples and filtering it, and we can run it through a series of tests and processing, and we can detect whether or not certain species of salmon are in the system. And so we're sampling from below the existing floodgate and above the existing floodgate, as well as in the main stem Nooksack, and we can use that information after the restoration has occurred to document whether or not the target species are in fact now using the habitat that we have restored, and that'll be a powerful tool for demonstrating restoration effectiveness for the projects. So just close with that, and basically the point of this was just to sort of highlight how we're using this information in the whole process, and I think it ties really well with what Paula Harris presented earlier on about the flip process and the reach team. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Jason. I'm also going to put a link to a survey into the chat for folks. We love to get feedback and input from people on our events. So I've put a link to our Qualtrics survey. I promise it's not particularly long, but we'd really appreciate you taking that survey. And what questions do you have for Jason? Here we go. What are the target species and life stages for the Cougar Creek Floodgate project?
Good question. So I can tell you right now that our eDNA samples are detecting coho and Omicus, which would be steelhead or rainbow trout in the system, both above and below. I believe the target species for restoration as far as improving fish passage into the system are juvenile Chinook, which use tributary habitat like Cougar Creek as off-channel rearing habitat, as well as refuge during high flows. But I imagine just in general, it's probably safe to say that there's not one particular target species for the restoration, but maybe Paula can chime in on that.
I'm the engineer in the room.
Yeah.
I would
Okay.
ask John Thompson here, who could speak to the fish side a little bit more, if he's still there.
I am.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, there I am, kind of a shadowy figure. Yeah. Based on some of the talks with landowners, there used to be significant chum salmon use in there. So really, I think the species that will benefit will be coho, steelhead, and chum. There's the potential for some flood refuge for the listed Chinook species, or the juvenile life stages, to get out of the floodwaters, both down below the floodgate, and then be able to access habitats on the floodplain. So it's kind of a multi-species benefit.
Thank you, John.
How does the charrette model differ from conventional approaches of doing this work?
It's quite a bit different, actually. Historically, I grew up in my professional career in Illinois, and we as engineers sat in our little offices and made these computer models. And then, we worked with our little communities to come up with ideas and model them. And then when we figured out what we thought was the best solution, we took it out to the public and saw what they thought, which is kind of totally opposite of how we're doing this design charrette. So we kind of start with our design charrette by bringing the background information like you saw here today, that's more specific to each reach when we meet with the people. And then we do this value-based planning, we share the values of this reach of river kind of through this sticky note exercise where everybody writes down all their different values, and we put them up on a board and try and clump them and come up with some shared values that we can all kind of agree on as we move into the work. And then we have a similar sticky note exercise where everybody comes up with solutions, and then we clump them up, and then we send those ideas to tables of people to work through and kind of have some guiding questions for them to come up with an answer. And that's how we developed the kind of the buckets of actions that come out of each of these design charrettes. So it's kind of starting from the grassroots, providing them some information, collecting ideas as we can, then going back and doing more technical work, and then coming back and reporting back. So that's kind of it's much more collaborative and involves, key players on the ground as well as at different agencies. So hopefully that answered your question.
Any other questions? And it takes a moment. We'll give it a moment. It looks like we may be finished. Will the recording be available? Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a fantastic event, very informative. And yes, this has been recorded, and we will, within a few days, get it posted to our Whatcom Win website. Again, that's whatcomwin.org. And I just want to thank all of our speakers again, helping us understand the integrated floodplain planning process and all of the effort that's going into meeting these multiple goals of reducing future flood risk while also recovering salmon populations and improving the future for our floodplain, for our agriculture and floodplain communities.